The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of their small house in the village of Kozara, Yugoslavia, on April 6, 1941. 10-year-old Marko sat at the wooden table, carefully carving a toy soldier from a piece of oak his father had given him the week before. His small hands worked the knife with precision, shaping what he imagined would be a brave warrior. His mother, Anna, stood by the stove, humming a folk song while preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread filled the room, mixing with the crisp spring air that drifted in from the open window. "Marko, be careful with that knife," she said without turning, her mother's instinct sensing the concentration in his silence. "I am." "Mama, look, I almost finished the helmet." She walked over, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron, and bent down to examine his work. Her dark hair fell across her face as she smiled. "It's beautiful, my love. Your father would be proud." At the mention of his father, Marko's eyes lit up. "When is Papa coming home?" Anna's smile flickered for just a moment. "Soon, darling. The mobilization is just a precaution. He'll be back before the plums ripen." But even as she spoke those words, the distant rumble of something that wasn't thunder rolled across the valley. Marko looked up from his carving, his young face confused. The rumbling grew louder, and suddenly the windows began to rattle. Anna's face went pale. "Marko, get under the—" The explosion that cut off her words was so loud it seemed to split the world in half. The windows shattered inward, sending glass flying across the kitchen. Marko felt his mother's body cover his as they hit the floor together. The toy soldier flew from his hands, clattering somewhere in the chaos. Through the broken window, he could see the sky, no longer the gentle blue of morning, but filled with dark shapes. Planes, dozens of them, like angry hornets, their engines screaming as they dove toward the earth. The cellar. "Now!" His mother pulled him to his feet and they ran. Behind them, their neighbor's house erupted in flames. Mrs. Petrovich, who had given him honeycakes just yesterday, was screaming a name, her son's name. Marko tried to look back, but his mother's grip was iron. The cellar was cold and dark, crowded with neighbors who had made it to safety. Old Mr. Jovanovich sat in the corner, his face gray as stone. The widow Maria clutched her infant grandson, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers. With each explosion above, dirt rained down from the ceiling. Marko pressed against his mother's side, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his chest. "Mama, what's happening?" She pulled him closer, and he felt wetness on his hair. His mother was crying, though she made no sound. "War, my darling. War has come." For 3 days they stayed in that cellar. The bombing continued in waves, sometimes hours apart, sometimes minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. When they emerged, blinking in the daylight, Marko didn't recognize his village. The church where he had been baptized was a pile of rubble. The school where he had learned to read was burning. And everywhere, there were people crying, searching through ruins, calling names that would never be answered. His mother held his hand tightly as they picked their way back to their house. The roof was gone. The kitchen where he had carved his toy soldier that morning was open to the sky. Amid the wreckage, Marko saw it, his wooden soldier split perfectly in half. He picked up both pieces, fitting them together in his small palm. They wouldn't stay joined. No matter how carefully he held them, they fell apart. "We have to find your father," his mother said, her voice hollow. "We have to get to his unit." What Marko didn't know then, what he couldn't have known, was that childhood, his childhood, had ended in those 3 days. The boy who had carved toy soldiers would soon learn to carry a real rifle. The hands that had shaped wood with such care would learn to pull a trigger. And the innocence that had filled his eyes that spring morning would be replaced by something else entirely. Something that would never leave him. Not even when the war ended. Not even decades later. When he was an old man, still dreaming of the toy soldier that broke in half. Still hearing his mother's voice saying words she didn't want to believe. War has come. The road to the Partisan camp wound through mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Marko walked beside his mother, his small legs aching with each step. They had been walking for 6 days. His shoes, too small even before they started, now rubbed blisters that had burst and bled and formed new blisters. But he didn't complain. Complaining was for children, and he was learning too quickly that he couldn't be a child anymore. Around them, the forest was beautiful in the way that only a Balkan spring can be. Wild flowers dotted the hillsides in purple and yellow, and somewhere high above, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents. It seemed impossible that beauty could exist in the same world as the horrors they had left behind in Kozara. But there it was, indifferent and eternal. They weren't alone on the road. Dozens of others moved in the same direction. Families torn apart, farmers who had left their fields, teachers without schools to teach in. An old woman pushed a wheelbarrow containing all her worldly possessions: a clock, a tea set, a framed photograph of her husband who had died in the Great War. A young mother carried twin babies, one on each hip, her face so exhausted it seemed carved from stone. On the second day, they had passed through a town the German army had already visited. Marko had seen things there that his mind refused to fully process. Bodies in the street, a girl's doll lying in a pool of blood, a dog, loyal even in death, lying beside its master. His mother had covered his eyes, but too late. Far too late. Don't look, Marko. Don't look. But how could he not look? This was the world now. This was what war meant. They met up with other refugees at a crossroads where an old stone marker pointed in 4 directions. A man named Stefan, who had been a schoolteacher before the invasion, had taken unofficial leadership of their group. He had a map drawn by hand showing the rumored location of partisan forces gathering in the mountains. 2 more days, Stefan told them, his voice trying to sound confident. Maybe 3. The partisans are organizing. We'll be safe there. Marko's mother, Anna, looked at the map with doubt in her eyes. And if the Germans find us first? Stefan's confident expression cracked. Then we pray. It's all any of us can do now. That night, they made camp in a clearing beside a stream. Someone started a small fire, carefully shielded so the smoke wouldn't give away their position. The adults spoke in low voices about the war, about what they had heard on radio broadcasts before the stations went dark. Germany, they said, was sweeping through Europe like a plague. Poland had fallen. France had fallen. Now Yugoslavia. Marko sat apart from the others, his back against a tree, and pulled out the 2 halves of his wooden soldier. In the firelight, they looked almost whole. He tried once more to fit them together, knowing it was futile, but unable to stop himself. This soldier was the last thing his father had given him before leaving for the mobilization. Before everything changed. You still have that? A voice beside him made him jump. It was a boy, perhaps a year or 2 older, with dark eyes that looked far too old for his face. I'm Petar, Marko. What is it? A soldier. I was making it when the bombs came. Peter sat down beside him, looking at the broken toy with an expression Marko couldn't read. I had a soccer ball, he said after a moment. Real leather. My father saved for months to buy it for my birthday. I left it behind when we ran. Stupid, right? People are dying and I'm thinking about a soccer ball. It's not stupid, Marko said quietly. My father didn't make it, Peter continued, his voice flat. He was in Belgrade when they bombed it. My mother, she doesn't talk anymore. She just walks. Like a ghost. Marko didn't know what to say to that. What words existed for such losses? So they sat in silence. 2 boys who should have been playing with toys and soccer balls, watching the firelight dance on the bark of trees. On the 9th day, they reached the partisan camp. It wasn't what Marko had expected. There were no neat rows of tents, no uniforms or flags. Instead, it was a collection of desperate people hidden in the mountain caves and forests. Farmers with hunting rifles, students with pistols they barely knew how to use, soldiers who had escaped the German advance with nothing but their lives and their anger. A man who called himself Commander Dushan met them at the perimeter. He was tall and lean, with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes that missed nothing. He looked over their ragged group with an expression that mixed sympathy and assessment. Women and children to the eastern caves, he said. Men who can fight, follow me. We need every hand. My son stays with me, Anna said firmly, pulling Marko close. Dushan looked down at Marko, studying him for a long moment. How old? 10, Anna answered. 10, Dushan repeated, and something like sadness crossed his face. I have a son. Had a son. He was 12. The Germans came to our village in the first week. He stopped, swallowed hard. Keep him close, mother. This mountain isn't safe, but it's safer than the valleys, safer than the towns. That night, in the cave that would be their home, Marko lay on a thin blanket spread over cold stone. Around him, other children slept or tried to. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the cave ceiling with empty eyes. Peter was nearby. His mother indeed silent as a ghost, staring at nothing. Marko pulled out his broken soldier once more, holding both pieces in his hands. In the darkness, a thought came to him. A realization that felt like growing up and dying at the same time. This soldier would never be whole again. He would never be whole again. The boy who had carved this toy was gone, replaced by someone else, someone harder. Someone who would have to learn to survive in a world where beauty and horror lived side by side, where children carried rifles and mothers prayed to gods who seemed to have stopped listening. Tomorrow, Commander Dushan would begin training anyone old enough to hold a weapon. Marko had seen the way the commander looked at him, the calculation in those hard eyes. He knew what was coming. The toy soldier slipped from his fingers as sleep finally claimed him, falling into the darkness between the stones. He didn't reach for it. Somewhere deep inside, in a place beyond words or conscious thought, he understood he wouldn't need it anymore. The first time Marko held a rifle, it was heavier than he expected. The Mosin Nagant was almost as tall as he was, the woodstock worn smooth by countless hands before his. Commander Dusan stood behind him in the clearing they used for training, adjusting Marko's grip with rough, practical movements. "The rifle is not your toy," Dusan said, his voice carrying the weight of hard lessons learned. "It is your life. It is your mother's life. It is the life of every person in this camp. Treat it with respect." 3 months had passed since they arrived at the Partisan camp. 3 months during which Marko had watched the world remake itself into something unrecognizable. The boy who once carved wooden soldiers now spent his days learning to shoot real ones. The distinction between childhood and warfare had collapsed like a house with no foundation. There were 15 other children in the training group, ranging from 9 to 14 years old. Peter stood beside him, his face set in grim concentration as he sighted down his own rifle. The dark-eyed boy who had once mourned a lost soccer ball now spoke only in tactical terms. "Cover, flanking positions, ammunition counts." "Breathe in," Dusan instructed. "Hold. Squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze." The rifle kicked against Marko's shoulder with shocking force. The target, a German uniform jacket stuffed with straw and pinned to a tree 50 meters away, remained untouched. The shot echoed through the valley, and Marko's heart raced with fear that it might have been heard by the wrong ears. "Again," Dusan said simply. By the end of that first day, Marko's shoulder was bruised purple and his arms shook with exhaustion. But he had hit the target, once, just once. Dusan had nodded with something that might have been approval, and Marko had felt a disturbing sense of pride. His mother had watched from the mouth of the cave, her face a mask of emotions Marko couldn't begin to interpret. That night, she held him close while he slept, as if she could protect him from what he was becoming, as if holding tight enough could stop the transformation. But nothing could stop it. The war had its own momentum, its own terrible logic. The German patrols came through the mountains regularly, hunting for partisan camps. They moved in coordinated sweeps, using dogs and local collaborators who knew the terrain. The partisans responded with ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage. It was a brutal game of cat and mouse, played for the highest stakes imaginable. Marko's first real engagement came on a cold morning in late July. The partisan scouts had spotted a German supply convoy moving along the mountain road. 3 trucks, lightly guarded, carrying food and ammunition desperately needed by the resistance. Commander Dusan assembled a strike team of 20 fighters. When he called Marko's name, the boy felt his stomach turn to ice. "You're ready," Dusan said. And it wasn't a question. Anna grabbed the commander's arm. "He's 10 years old. 10, my God, he's a baby." "He's a soldier," Dusan replied, not unkindly. "Look around you, mother. We're all soldiers now. Age doesn't matter anymore. Only survival." The ambush position was on a ridge overlooking the road. Marko lay in the dirt beside Petar and an older fighter named Luka, a 19-year-old who had been a medical student before the war. Below them, the road curved sharply, the perfect killing ground. "Remember," Luka whispered. "Wait for the commander's signal, then aim for the driver of the front truck. Stop the convoy first, then we can take what we need." Marko's hands were slippery with sweat on the rifle stock. His heart hammered so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. This wasn't a straw target. These were men. Living, breathing men who would die because of what he and others were about to do. The sound of the trucks grew louder. Marko could see them now, grinding slowly up the mountain road. German soldiers sat in the truck beds, rifles across their laps, looking bored. They were young, too, some barely older than teenagers themselves. One was smoking a cigarette. Another was laughing at something his companion had said. Marko's finger found the trigger. The rifle sights centered on the windshield of the lead truck. He could see the driver clearly. A man with a round face and a thick mustache. In another life, he might have been someone's friendly uncle, someone who told jokes and gave candy to children. The signal came, a sharp whistle from Commander Dusan's position. The valley exploded with gunfire. Marko squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The windshield of the lead truck spiderwebbed with cracks. He didn't know if his bullet had hit the driver, or if it was one of the dozen other shots that converged on the same target. He didn't want to know. The truck swerved wildly, crashed into the mountainside. German soldiers spilled out of the vehicles, taking cover, returning fire. Bullets whined through the air, striking rocks, sending up sprays of dirt. Beside Marko, Luka was firing methodically, working the bolt action of his rifle with practiced efficiency. The firefight lasted perhaps 5 minutes. It felt like hours. When it was over, the road was silent except for the ticking of hot engines and the moans of the wounded. The partisans moved down from their positions carefully, weapons ready. 8 German soldiers lay dead. 3 were wounded and would become prisoners. 2 had fled into the forest and escaped. The convoy was theirs. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, all desperately needed. Marko stood over one of the fallen soldiers. The man was young, maybe 20, with blonde hair and blue eyes that stared sightlessly at the sky. A photograph had fallen from his pocket, a woman holding a baby. His wife. His child. "Don't look," Peter said, pulling Marko away. "Don't think about it. You can't think about it, or you'll go mad." But Marko had already looked. He had already seen, and he would carry that image. That young father who would never return home. That baby who would grow up without knowing his papa for the rest of his life. That night, back at camp, the partisans celebrated their successful raid. There would be food for another week, bullets for another ambush. Commander Dushin praised the fighters, singled out Marko and Peter for their courage under fire. Marko's mother held him in the cave, rocking him as she had when he was small. "My baby," she whispered. "My poor baby." But he wasn't a baby. Not anymore. He was a soldier who had taken a life before his 11th birthday. A boy who carried a rifle instead of toys. Who knew the weight of a trigger pull and the sound a man makes when death comes for him. Outside, the mountain wind carried the smell of gunpowder and pine trees, of blood and wild flowers. The world had become a place where such contradictions lived side by side, where children learned to kill and still somehow had to find a way to remain human. Marko closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Behind his eyelids, he saw the German soldier, saw the photograph, saw the baby who would never know his father. And he wondered, with a despair that felt like drowning, whether he would ever be able to forget, whether any of them would. The rifle leaned against the cave wall beside him, ready for tomorrow. Because there would be a tomorrow, and another after that, and each one would demand the same terrible price. This was war. This was what it meant to have your childhood stolen, replaced with something that could never be given back. Winter came to the mountains like an invader, brutal and unforgiving. The partisan camp, already struggling, descended into a desperate fight against the elements as fierce as any battle with the Germans. Snow piled up in drifts taller than a man. The wind howled through the caves like the voices of the dead. And hunger, constant, gnawing hunger, became their most relentless enemy. Marko was 11 now, though the date had passed without celebration or acknowledgement. Time had become meaningless, measured only in operations, ambushes, and losses. He moved through the camp with the economical efficiency of a veteran fighter. His rifle always close, his eyes always scanning. The training had paid off in the cruelest way possible. Marko had become an effective soldier. He could field strip his rifle blindfolded, navigate by stars, identify German units by their insignia. He had been in 7 firefights and survived them all. Each one had taken something from him, small pieces of his soul that would never be recovered. Petar had become his shadow, the 2 boys forming the kind of bond that only shared trauma can forge. They rarely spoke about anything beyond the immediate and practical, where the next patrol would be, how to keep their weapons from freezing, whether the ice on the stream was thick enough to cross. Personal feelings, fears, hopes. These were luxuries they couldn't afford. But on a February night, with the wind screaming outside the cave and the temperature far below freezing, Petar broke the unspoken rule. "Do you ever think about after?" he asked suddenly. Marko looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "After what?" "After the war. When it's over." The question seemed absurd. The war would never be over. It was the only reality that existed. But looking at Petar's face in the dim firelight, Marko saw something he hadn't seen in months. Hope. Fragile as a moth's wing, but there. "Sometimes," Marko admitted, "I think about my father, whether he's still alive, whether we'll find each other." "My mother still doesn't speak," Petar said quietly. "It's been almost a year, but yesterday I saw her smile, just for a second, when one of the women was singing an old folk song. Do you think people can come back from this?" Before Marko could answer, the alarm went up. A sharp whistle from the sentries that meant immediate danger. The cave exploded into controlled chaos. Fighters grabbed weapons. Mothers shielded children. The elderly moved to the deepest recesses of the mountain. "German patrol," the runner gasped out. "Big one. They're searching cave by cave. They have dogs." Commander Dushin's face was grim. We need to buy time for the evacuation. Fighters with me. Children and elderly to the North Passage. It leads down to the ravine. Go now, Marko's mother grabbed his arm. You're coming with us. No. The word came out harder than he intended. Mama, I'm a fighter. You know that. I have to stay. You're my son. You're 11 years old. Anna, Commander Dushan's voice cut through her protest. He's right. We need everyone who can shoot. I promise you, I'll look after him. The look on his mother's face would haunt Marko forever. Agony, pride, terror, resignation, all warring for dominance. She pulled him close, kissed his forehead with such fierce love it hurt. Come back to me, she whispered. Whatever else happens, come back to me. Then she was gone, swept up in the evacuation, and Marko was moving with the fighters to the defensive positions they had prepared for exactly this situation. 23 partisans against what turned out to be a German force of over 80 soldiers. The mathematics were brutal, but the terrain favored defense. The cave complex had multiple entrances, narrow passages, choke points where superior numbers meant nothing. The first Germans entered the caves cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Marko waited in his position, wedged into a crevice that overlooked the main passage. Beside him, Luka breathed steadily, his rifle aimed at the kill zone below. The battle that followed was unlike the ambushes Marko had experienced before. This was close-quarters combat in near-total darkness. A nightmarish confusion of muzzle flashes, ricocheting bullets, screams that echoed off stone walls until they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marko fired when targets presented themselves, shadowy figures illuminated briefly by gunfire. He didn't think about who they were, didn't let himself see them as human. They were threats to his mother, to Petar, to everyone he cared about. That was all, but the Germans kept coming. They had the numbers, the training, the equipment. One by one, partisan positions fell. Luka went down with a bullet through the lung, drowning in his own blood. Commander Dushan held the main passage until his ammunition ran out, then fought with a knife until a grenade blast silenced him forever. Marko found himself retreating deeper into the caves with Petar and 3 other fighters. They were being pushed back toward the North Passage where the civilians had fled. If the Germans reached them there... We have to collapse the tunnel, said Radmila, a fierce woman who had been a schoolteacher before becoming one of their best fighters. Trap them in here with us. Buy time for the others to get away. We'll be trapped too, Petar said. Yes, Radmila replied simply. But they'll live. That's all that matters now. The explosive charges were crude, grenades wired together with salvaged German ordnance. They set them at 3 points along the passage, then took up position at the far end. The Germans came carefully, having learned respect for partisan resistance. Marko could see their helmet lights bobbing in the darkness. Now! Radmila screamed. The explosions were deafening in the confined space. The roof came down in a cascade of rock and dust that seemed to go on forever. When it finally stopped, silence pressed in like a physical weight. Marko couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond the ringing in his ears. His lungs burned with dust. Gradually, sensation returned. He was alive. Beside him, Petar coughed violently. Somewhere, Radmila was calling out names, checking for survivors. 3 of their group had made it. The others were buried under tons of rock, along with an unknown number of Germans on the far side. They had bought time, but at what cost? They were trapped in the dark, in a sealed mountain, with limited air and no way out except through the North Passage, if it was even still passable. Move, Radmila ordered. We need to find another exit before we suffocate. They crawled through passages that grew narrower and narrower, until Marko was squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for his thin frame. His rifle scraped against stone, his hands bled from sharp rocks. Time lost meaning in the absolute darkness. Minutes or hours could have passed. Then, impossibly, a breath of fresh air. A crack of light. They emerged from a fissure on the mountainside to find dawn breaking over a landscape of pristine white snow. They were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. The reunion with the evacuated group was subdued. Too many faces were missing. Commander Dushan, Luka, a dozen others who had given their lives buying time. Marko's mother held him so tightly he could barely breathe, sobbing into his hair words that made no sense, and perfect sense all at once. That night, what remained of their group huddled around a small fire in a new hiding place. They numbered 37 now, down from nearly 100. The losses were staggering, but they were alive. Marko stared into the flames, thinking about Commander Dushan's last stand, about Luka dying beside him, about all the small deaths he had witnessed and caused. The rifle leaned against his shoulder, constant companion, hated necessity. He was 11 years old and he had killed more men than he could count. What kind of man would he become when this war finally ended? Would he even survive to find out? And if he did, would there be anything left of the boy who once carved toy soldiers in his mother's kitchen? The questions had no answers, so he simply sat, keeping watch through another cold mountain night, carrying burdens no child should ever have to bear. The war ended, not with a dramatic moment, but with a gradual awareness that the killing had finally stopped. By spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The partisan networks received word through crackling radio transmissions. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Marko was 14 now, though he looked both older and younger than his years. His body had grown lean and hard from years of deprivation and constant movement. But his eyes carried the weight of things no child should witness. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow survived. The partisan camp had relocated 17 times since that terrible winter night 3 years ago. Their numbers had swelled and contracted with the tides of war, gaining new refugees fleeing German reprisals, losing fighters to bullets and disease, and the simple grinding exhaustion of endless struggle. Through it all, Marko had remained, a ghost of the boy who once carved wooden toys, a soldier who had forgotten how to be anything else. When the official word came, the war in Europe was over. The celebration was muted. Too much had been lost. Too many empty spaces where people used to be. Marko stood apart from the others, his rifle still slung across his shoulder, unable to accept that the fighting had truly ended. Petar found him there, looking out over the valley that had been their battlefield for so long. Petar's mother stood nearby, speaking quietly to another woman, speaking for the first time in 4 years. Small miracles emerging from the ruins. "We can go home now," Petar said, "or what's left of it." Home. The word felt foreign in Marko's mouth. "I don't even know if there is a home to go back to. Then we'll build a new one." That's what the commander used to say, remember? That after the war, we'd build something better. Marko thought about Commander Dushan, dead these 3 years, buried under tons of mountain rock. About Luka with his medical textbooks and dreams of healing people. About all the others who would never see this day. How do we do that? Marko asked quietly. How do we go back to being normal people after everything we've done? Petar had no answer. No one did. The journey back to Kozara took 2 weeks. They traveled in groups now, armed but no longer hunted. The countryside they passed through bore the scars of occupation. Burned villages, abandoned farms, graves marked by crude wooden crosses. But there were also signs of renewal. Farmers in fields, children playing, life asserting itself with stubborn insistence. When Marko finally saw his village, or what remained of it, his legs nearly gave out. The church was still rubble. Most of the houses had been destroyed or burned, but his house still stood. Partially roofless, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, but standing. His mother stopped beside him, her hand finding his. "Shall we see what's left?" The kitchen where he had carved his toy soldier that morning a lifetime ago was open to the sky. Rain had damaged the floorboards. Grass grew through cracks, but the wooden table was still there. Weathered and scarred, but recognizable. Marko knelt down, running his hands over the surface. Here, right here, he had sat as a child, making toys and believing the world was safe. The memory seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Marko. His mother's voice was strange. Look, in the corner, wedged between floorboards and covered in dirt, she had found something. She cleaned it off with her sleeve, then held it out to him. The 2 halves of his wooden soldier. The toy he had been carving that last morning of his childhood. He took them with shaking hands, fitting the pieces together the way he had done so many times before. They still wouldn't stay joined. The break was too clean, too complete. Some things once broken could never be truly mended. But as he looked at that toy soldier, witness to everything that had changed, Marko felt something shift inside him. For 4 years, he had been a weapon. He had learned to kill, to survive, to bury every soft feeling that might get him or others killed. He had become exactly what the war demanded. Now, holding these pieces of his childhood, he made a choice. He would not let the war have the last word. He would not let it define the rest of his life. "Mama," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had suppressed for years. "Teach me again. Teach me how to be your son instead of a soldier." Anna gathered him into her arms. This boy who was taller than her now. This child who had been forced to become a man too soon. "We'll learn together," she whispered. "One day at a time." The rifle, that constant companion, that hated necessity, Marko propped against the wall. Tomorrow he would take it to the collection point where weapons were being gathered, melted down, transformed into something useful instead of deadly. Tomorrow he would begin the long, painful process of becoming human again. But tonight, he sat at the old kitchen table with his mother, watching the sun set over their broken village, holding two pieces of a wooden soldier that would never be whole. All across Europe, millions of others were doing the same, trying to pick up shattered pieces of their lives, trying to remember who they had been before the war, trying to imagine a future that didn't involve blood and fear and loss. It would take time, years, decades. Some wounds would never heal, some memories would never fade, but the guns had fallen silent, and in that silence, there was at least the possibility of something better. Marko placed both halves of the soldier carefully on the table, side by side, but separate. Then, for the first time in 4 years, he allowed himself to cry for the childhood that had been stolen, for the friends who hadn't survived, for the person he might have been if the world had been kinder. His mother held him as he wept, her own tears falling silently. Outside, the first stars appeared in the evening sky, the same stars that had watched over all the horror of the past 4 years. They kept their ancient vigil, indifferent and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the work of rebuilding, the struggle to live with memories that couldn't be forgotten, the difficulty of relearning tenderness after years of hardness. But tomorrow was not yet here. Tonight, there was only this, a mother and her son, survivors of a war that had tried to break them, sitting together in the ruins of their home and choosing, against all the darkness they had seen, to hope. Because hope, Marko realized, was its own kind of courage. To believe that life could be good again after witnessing such evil. To trust that healing was possible after such deep wounds. To imagine that a boy who carried a rifle instead of toys could someday find his way back to laughter, to innocence, to joy. The wooden soldier remained on the table, broken but preserved, a reminder of what was lost and what survived. And as Marko finally closed his eyes that night, sleeping in his childhood home for the first time in 4 years, he dreamed not of war but of a future where children could carve toys without fear, where families could sit together in peace, where the only battles were the everyday struggles of building a life worth living. The war had stolen his childhood. That truth would never change. But it had not stolen his future. That he would reclaim, one difficult day at a time. Your turn now. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of what war truly costs, leave a comment below. Tell us, what would you be willing to sacrifice to protect those you love? And if you believe stories like Marko's need to be remembered, if you believe we must never forget what children like him endured so we might live in peace, then subscribe to this channel. Help us share these untold histories. Help us honor those who gave everything. Because the greatest tragedy isn't just what happened to Marko and millions like him. It's forgetting that it happened at all. Share this story. Remember their sacrifice. And pray that no child ever has to carry a rifle instead of a toy again.